Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tycos. Just a few days ago, a hawkish member of the Federal Reserve Board stated, quote, "I remain willing to raise the target range for the federal funds rate at a future meeting should progress on inflation stall or even reverse," end quote. Now, we're not wild about doing another video on inflation, but where interest rates go matters. While we feel this issue has already been settled, when the Fed continues to push this issue, it's important to put the facts out there. Let's take a closer look at the data, starting with price changes on a month-over-month basis, which gives us the clearest look at the absolute most recent trend. We will use 3 price indexes. Through May, CPI, the Consumer Price Index, was up a mere 0.17%. which, if you annualize it, equals 1.99% annualized. PPI, the Producer Price Index, or prices paid to domestic producers, was down 0.29%. And PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, favored by the Fed for its broader scope of household goods and services and its quicker adjustment to consumption changes, remained flat in essence at negative 0.01%. Over the last 12 months, annualized month-over-month CPI inflation has averaged 3.2%, PPI 2.2%, and PCE 2.5%. Isn't that perhaps close enough to 2% to count? Especially since higher interest rates, by our analysis, are contributing to higher housing costs and higher costs of goods, since interest costs are a big factor in these items. To underscore this, the June number, released just this Thursday and seasonally adjusted as the Fed typically does, was negative 0.1%, or on an annualized basis, negative 0.7%. The truth is, high inflation ended in July of 2022, at a time when interest rates were only 2%. So clearly, higher rates were not a factor in bringing down that inflation rate, that what we would consider a plunge in the inflation rate. Let's look. In June of 2022, linked month CPI was 1.37%, which was an ugly 16.5% if you annualize it. No wonder consumers were suffering. But 1 month later, in July, it was all the way down to negative 0.01%. For PPI, it went from 1% in June of 2022, or 12.1% annualized, to negative 0.38%, or negative 4.6% annualized in July. PCE went from 0.91%, or 10.9% annualized in June, to 0.01% in July. At that moment, July of 2022, high inflation, the high level we had clearly reached in June and had been there for the several months prior to that, was over, even though the Fed's view was that 3% was not low enough. It has been in that reasonably low 3% range now for 23 consecutive months. From that July 2022 moment forward, linked month CPI has averaged 0.25%, or 3% annualized. PPI has averaged 0.10%, or 1.2% annualized. And PCE has averaged 0.24%, or 2.9% annualized. That doesn't mean prices are low. In fact, they are up 20% since the beginning of 2021. So households have reason to be concerned and upset. but they are no longer rising rapidly and have not been rising rapidly for almost 2 years. As we showed last week, almost every country around the world has seen similar trends in inflation, so you can toss out any theory that it was the Congress or any U.S.-specific factor that was culpable. Instead, it was the pandemic and wars around the globe, and then the Fed's interest rates, which inadvertently added to that. And note that we are seeing the world's inflation continue to improve. The UK's just went down to 2.0%. France's was 2.1%, and Germany's was 2.2%. China's was 0.30%, which is extremely low, and they'd been deflationary prior to that. And Japan's underlying inflation was 2.9%. Now, we aren't naive enough to not recognize that inflation could again trend higher, especially given the wild cards of wider war and its impact on energy prices, and the pernicious effect of higher interest rates on inflation, along with other factors. But for now, inflation has been benign for 23 straight months, and especially benign over the last few. Now that you know all that, listen again to this quote from a Fed governor. Quote, "I remain willing to raise the target range for the federal funds rate at a future meeting should progress on inflation stall or even reverse." Kind of makes you wonder how disconnected the Fed really is from the day-to-day financial challenges of America's households. That's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe so you don't miss out next week. Thanks.